Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. This is episode 8 on Papal Supremacy at the Second Council of Nicaea in 787 with my guest today, Erick Ybarra. Erick, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm terrific. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, definitely. I'm really honored to have you on. It's funny because back in 2018 is when I first heard about you and saw your blog there on the papacy, and I was looking into the papacy and claims between Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism, and I had read Steve Ray's book Upon This Rock, and I was reading actually Oliver Clement's You Are Peter, his perspective, Orthodox perspective on the primacy, and I was in a Facebook page at the time. I don't know if it's still around today, but I think Catholic Theology Geeks. And
Yeah,
okay. And so I had posted in there different claims that Oliver Clement made about primacy, and then you had posted a link to an article on, I think it was of Gregory the Great and the ecumenical title of the Universal Bishop controversy. And it was funny because I was like, oh, wow, this is a great blog. And I started reading some of the other stuff in it and stuff on Cyprian. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. I love this stuff. And then I realized that you were the author of the blog, because I thought that the guy that commented and sent it to me, which was you, was just some rando on the internet. I was like, oh, thank you, so-and-so. But then I was like, I saw the name of the blog and I saw the person that posted it and I made the connection. And I was like, oh, well, hey. And then I started messaging you. And then we, for most of 2018, I just pretty much started reading a lot of the books that you had suggested to me. So, yeah.
Yeah.
So, thanks a lot for that.
No, you're welcome. I'm just passing down things I got from others. So it works in a chain like that.
Yeah, it's really good. And there was another gentleman, I forget his name. I need to track it down actually to thank him, because he had also sent me a somewhat similar list as well on books on the papacy, and that just expanded my mind on it. And now I've read, I think, 37 books on the subject.
Wow.
So this is Father Ramsey's book is 38. So I'm trying to match also to the Orthodox perspective to Catholic, because there's a few Anglicans I've read, like Denny and Puller and Gore and Giles and people like that, but I want to make sure that the critical and like the pro and then like the in between are kind of pretty much either even or close enough, basically. Sure. But yeah, so love nerding out on that. And but today we're going to talk about papal supremacy at the Second Council of Nicaea in 787 AD. Before we get to that though, I'm going to just briefly read off your bio here. So Erick Ybarra is a revert to the Catholic faith from Protestantism. He is an author with 2 pending books for publication on the papacy and the filioque, and has spent the last 10 years studying the schism between Catholics and Orthodox. He is a speaker that has appeared on various social media outlets, but is most famous for his contribution as a co-host of YouTube's Reason and Theology. He lives in the Midwest with his wife and 6 young boys, which actually, if you don't mind me asking, is it Florida now?
Yeah, we moved down south about 3.5 weeks ago, almost 4 weeks ago.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah, and it's at the Orlando or Sanford area. I've been there before.
Yeah, Central Florida area. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I have a lot of friends that are coming into the church that are down there. Ethan Dolan, his brother Liam, Michael Hall, and Aaron Lagoo. All shout out to all them. Are all
wow. Yeah, I think I've had the pleasure to become acquainted with a couple of them, and I've actually met some of them in person. So it's a blessing.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. I'm glad to hear that. Yeah. So, Erick, I want to get into the subject here. So I have some questions for you. And my first question for you is, what inspired you to write these articles?
Yeah, so I wrote one article on my blog on Pope Hadrian II and the papal claims at Nicaea 787. And that first article did not originally intend for a second article. So I thought that I was going to write one article and that was going to be it. What inspired me to write that first one was I saw a debate between Likoudis, Dr. James Likoudis, and an Eastern Orthodox YouTuber, Criag Truglia. And I listened to that debate, and it was clear to me that it seemed as though Dr. James Likoudis wasn't aware of how precise, the debate was going to be. I kind of looked like he just thought this was a debate about papal supremacy in the first millennium, maybe with a focus on the Seventh Council. Whereas Criag Truglia, it looks like he's been sort of trying to really study a specific issue at the council. And so when I saw that, I said, well, somebody should write an article about the way, how could a Catholic answer the objections that Truglia was bringing up in the debate. But at first I didn't think about writing anything. What kind of really moved the needle for me was we did at Reason and Theology, we had Richard Price on, and then we had Dr. James Likoudis on, and we spoke about the debate with Criag Truglia. It wasn't a main focus of the discussion. It was sort of like a last minute thing. Dr. Likoudis asked if he could bring up some of the issues that came up in the debate, and I actually did not listen to the full debate at that point. In fact, I think I have this backwards. I think we had Dr. Likoudis on to talk about the debate, and I told him I didn't listen to it, so he'd have to fill me in on what he wanted to talk about. Then after that, I listened to the whole debate. Then Criag Truglia did a response to our video with Dr. Likoudis and Dr. Price, and he was under the impression that we planned that as a response to his debate. If you listen to Criag Truglia's YouTube video, you'll see, look at Nicaea II. If you search Nicaea II, you'll see a couple of, the debate and his little response video to Reason and Theology, which I thought was just far off the mark. I mean, we had no intention of responding to the debate. We hadn't even listened to it, and I even said that, and so did William in the video. Mm-hmm. So Criag thought his video was, or he thought his debate with Likoudis was such a spectacular thing that we just scrambled and got together to make a response video. That's not what happened. Yeah. But it did come up, so we did answer a few things. So anyway, the video response that he gave rehearsed some of the arguments that he brought up in his debate with Dr. Likoudis. And again, I thought they were very weak arguments and objections. And I thought that I think he's got the wrong understanding of the debate between Catholics and Orthodox on the issue of Nicaea II. He touches some issues that have import, but other ones just don't have any relevance to the subject. So that was when I said, you know what, I'm going to write a response and put it into a clear blog form, so that way people, if there are some nerdy people out there who are actually listening to these discussions on YouTube. And it really piques their interest. And, maybe Criag Truglia said something that, oh, wow, he said, what do we do about this? And what do we do about that? I want it there to be something that people can go to see that his points really dissolve, when you put it under scrutiny. And that's basically it. I don't normally respond to Criag Truglia. I try to not listen to him, without going into any detail. He's blocked me from communication, for example, on Facebook. And he left Reason and Theology on bad terms. And so, it's one of those relationships that just sort of got killed. And we hope that we could just be cordial if we ever come across each other. I'd hope that, but it is a challenge. So I didn't want to write an article because it might make him think that somehow we have this scheme going on or trying to refute his material. This was just really a unique case.
Gotcha. Yeah, it was just an interaction, and for the record too. Yeah, I in preparation for this, I've read your first article, your second one, and then I've watched the interview you guys did on Reason and Theology with Father Dr. Richard Price, and then the follow up with James Likoudis, and then I've also watched Criag Truglia's debate with Dr. Likoudis, and then also his review of your guys's video interviewing Dr. Likoudis and going over the debate and to some extent, some detail. It wasn't the whole part of the video, but it definitely came up as you said. And I just wanted to say that for clarification for everyone. And I will provide links into the description for all those as well to kind of give this sort of like a commentary upon all of that as the preceding background to this video, in essence. Also, before I continue on, I want to go ahead and share my screen real quick. Let me see here. So just for everyone, this is, well, hang on. The first one, this is Erick's article up here. Yep. Comparing the Greek and Latin texts of Pope Hadrian's letters read aloud at Nicaea II. Did the Greek text reject papal supremacy and infallibility? And then the second article, response to objections concerning the papal claims of Pope Hadrian I at the Second Council of Nicaea, 787. And so I just wanted to screen share that with everyone because I'll link these in the description as well, and all of Erick Ybarra's description as well for his blog and website. And then also for everyone too, he did a presentation on Swan Sona's channel, Intellectual Conservatism, Papal Supremacy at the Second Council of Nicaea, 787. I love by the way, your slides there are really nice looking. So I'm like, well done on that. It's very aesthetically pleasing. And then there was a follow-up with Alan Rule and Swan Sona as well, and they went over some stuff. So just thought I mentioned that all for by way of background, and I'll stop sharing my screen. So thank you for that context, Erick. I think that really helped. And I just want to say, and I don't mean this in any uncharitable way. I mean this with all sincerity and charity for Dr. Likoudis, since he is, one, my elder, and two, he's far more intelligent than I am and well-read and educated. And also, I don't doubt that he's also more holy than I am too. I mean, I'm just a kid. And he's my senior, and so he has more experience in life. Right. But at the same time, I kind of feel morally compelled to say that I don't think he did that well in the debate with Criag. And I don't think that means Criag won or is right. Well, actually, no, I actually will say I think Criag did win by terms of debate standards. But I don't think his arguments were necessarily amazing or anything like that. And so what do you think about that, if you don't mind commenting on that? Because I was just, and maybe it was different I wasn't aware of that, maybe different understandings coming to the debate, because I felt like Dr. Likoudis brought up really good points on other subjects, but the debate was about Nicaea II. And so I kind of felt that my first impression was sort of that Dr. Likoudis was kind of all over the place, and Craig was actually sticking to the subject of the topic. Now, if it was a miscommunication about what the debate was about, that's fair and fine. But it did seem kind of like there was more focus on Craig's part than Dr. Likoudis. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, you brought up the issue of debate standards, and that's really what, unfortunately and fortunately, that's how debate works. You have an affirmative, and then you have a negating side. And, in terms of success and failure, it really doesn't matter who's right, ontologically speaking.
Right.
If somebody comes to the debate table with the affirmative, trying to prove that a living eggplant is ready to, it has the president at gunpoint, and the negating side doesn't successfully correspond to the position, the positive evidence that's being put forward by the positive affirming side, then the person who negates it is going to lose the debate.
Yeah.
And so the person proving that an eggplant's taken over the United States is he would win the debate, but that doesn't mean he's correct.
Right.
So, yeah, further reflection on that, I think, like I said, I think I was telling you before that we start the show, I think Dr. Likoudis did not understand what the debate was about. It kind of looked like he thought this was just about papal supremacy in the first millennium with a focus on Nicaea II. Whereas Criag Truglia has been, he's parked himself to study very acutely a specific issue at Nicaea II. And so I don't think that Dr. Likoudis was expecting that, because Craig was a little bit more into certain details that you don't really know. Even historians don't know until they review it, at least. And in order to do that, you got to let them know, hey, we're going to be debating the letters of Hadrian and their authenticity, the reliable record between the Greek and the Latin codices. When you tell somebody that, I think it's a little bit more perhaps fair. And maybe they did discuss that before the debate. I don't know. To me, it didn't seem like Dr. Likoudis was ready. He wasn't even aware of that. So I think that, Dr. Likoudis made good points, but I think Craig's affirming side really was not confronted with any sort of argument that can dissolve what he was saying.
Yeah, I agree. It seemed like that was definitely the case, and I appreciate your thoughts on that, because, yeah, it definitely struck me as sort of missing the mark in terms of like the very specific point, the pointed questions and statements and arguments that Craig brought forward. And so, yeah, I think that's the fair analysis. All right, so by way of background, because that is the context to this video that we're talking about here, I want to ask you, what is Nicaea II? Like, let's start with that for those who may not be aware of what Nicaea II even is.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, Nicaea II comes on the heels of some other historical issues that are going on, particularly in the East, with the Church of Constantinople, and in particular the imperial throne, which had been for many years in support of the iconoclastic position against the images. You had emperors that wanted to destroy images. You had emperors who wanted to shun them. You had those who did not believe in the venerating of images, but didn't want them destroyed necessarily. The imperial throne, for a good many years, had been in support of at least the eradication of images of icons, and so by the time you get to the Council of Nicaea, the East wants to fix this problem of iconoclasm, and this is also going to serve as a way to bridge back unity with Rome, because the East, Constantinople, had excommunicated Rome, and Rome had excommunicated Constantinople over the issue of iconoclasm. So this was a reunion effort. So you've got the rise of Empress Irene, who's taking over the vice regent of her son, he's too young to run the throne. So he can't until he gets to a certain age. And she writes a letter in the name of the throne of Byzantium to Pope Hadrian, pleading with him to come in person to host an ecumenical council in the East. Originally, it was supposed to be in Constantinople, in order to, number one, condemn the Council of Hieria, which was held in 754, which was a pro-iconoclastic council held by a former Byzantine emperor with many bishops from Constantinople. So to reverse the iconoclastic policy of Constantinople, number one, and number two, to bridge the unity between the East and the West. So that's what kind of got the council going. Now, Rome wanted unity with Constantinople, of course, but there were some other issues that Constantinople needed to fix, and most notably is the confiscation of jurisdiction that Rome had over territory in what later would be called the Balkan territory, Macedonia, Corinth, basically the prefecture of Illyricum, and also territory in Calabria and Sicily in the west. These were basically overtaken by Byzantine hierarchs per order of the emperor, and also the funds that the Church of Rome would receive from Calabria and Sicily for the production of candles and for the distribution to the poor, that was also cut off from going to Rome. And this was done by Emperor Leo the Emperor Leo III. He's more popularly known as Leo the Isaurian. He's a very iconoclastic emperor who went against the Pope, and as a result of the Pope defending the veneration of images, Leo the Isaurian, sort of like as a punishment, many scholars believe, he confiscated these territories from Roman patriarchal jurisdiction. Some scholars think it was that was a result of something a couple decades later, but I think I'm with the majority of scholarship thinking that it was right around that time when Pope Gregory II basically excommunicated the emperor and anybody else who decided to destroy any images. So Rome, particular Pope Hadrian I, had his criteria for reunion with Byzantium, and it was definitely that territory would be restored back to Rome, and also that the Byzantines would finally condemn iconoclasm. And there were some other issues. in-house issues with the titles of the Patriarch of Constantinople, calling himself ecumenical patriarch. Kind of a quirky issue there. It lasts from Gregory the First all the way to the later period of the 9th century. It's kind of a quirky issue, but Nicaea II ended up condemning iconoclasm, and this is one of the reasons why Pope Hadrian I didn't ratify it as an ecumenical council. He ratified it as an Orthodox synod, and definitely believed the decrees against iconoclasm were valid, binding, and all that. But he hesitated to rank it as number 7. So he continued to look at the ecumenical council list as 6. It wasn't until the latter part of the 9th century under Pope Hadrian II, where Nicaea II gets ranked on the shelf with the other 6.
Interesting. Yeah, I didn't know that, or I guess I forgot about like the because in a lot of church history books, it's usually kind of talks about the ratification of Nicaea II under Pope Hadrian I, and sometimes it doesn't really seem to mention the fact of its status as ecumenical till later on. I understand that there was about like pretty much a century of debate back and forth between East and West, and internal division within the East between the iconoclasts and the iconophiles. Right. And then you have, of course, the Sunday of Orthodoxy with icon veneration being exposited and cheered on there.
yeah, that's 843. Was the final. It was like the final death blow to iconoclasm to a large extent for the East.
Yeah, I really appreciate that descriptive history. And one thing that I wanted to ask you, because as you mentioned it, sometimes it's kind of looked over, I think, especially for Catholics. I think there needs to be kind of focus on this. And you mentioned how Constantinople excommunicated Rome and Rome excommunicated Constantinople. So one thought that kind of arises in my mind is this question: if Rome had papal supremacy, how was it that Constantinople would have thought it was okay or had the audacity to excommunicate Rome at that time?
Yeah, it's this is hitting on an issue that 21st century scholarship has truly refined perspectives on history. Both Orthodox and Catholics, up until the 20th century, the late 20th century, they just kind of assumed that in the first millennium, Orthodox East and Orthodox West, and when I say Orthodox, I mean small o here, small o. So they just assumed that small o Orthodox West and small o Orthodox East were always in perfect agreement, had the same perspective on everything, and there was no disagreement in ecclesiology. But that has been slowly deconstructed through Byzantinologists, Roman historians, church historians. You look back at the scholarship of Monsignor Pierre Batifol, who he wrote towards the end of the 20th century, and he came to the realization that there was some sort of shift in Byzantium. There was some sort of shift in the East. The Greeks did not precisely have, at least always, an understanding of Rome as the, the absolute principle of unity. In other words, you have to be in communion with the Pope in order to be in communion with Christ and his church. That was not an absolute for significant Greek representatives, of the Eastern tradition. Now that's kind of revolutionary, because that to think that would be to say that there was some sort of divided belief on the issue. And then likewise, Greek Orthodox tended to think that, Augustine was, did not believe the Filioque. He couldn't believe the Filioque, because if he did, you have one of these high-ranking church fathers that holds to, the single most influential heresy, splitting the Christendom in half, Filioque. So it was important for them to say, no, that, the church fathers can't teach the Filioque. Well, it turns out that most of scholarship today admits that Augustine's taught the Filioque, and many Latin writers taught the Filioque. So both Catholics and Orthodox have had to sort of wash their face in the sink and rub their eyes, so they could see that the first millennium was not just this, perfectly agreed upon community. You had some sort of a parallel divisiveness going on between the East and the West while they were in communion. So we get this already in the 4th century, where you've got certain bishops that were baptized and trained in the tradition of the 3rd century, who rejected the Council of Nicaea. They rejected Pope Sylvester. They rejected Pope Julius. They rejected Pope Liberius, Pope Damasus. And they were ready to just sort of hold their own independent churches in the East that held to the Arian belief system. And they were more than ready to give up their life, to just, break away from Rome and Athanasius and the council. So already in the East, you have people who are harboring this instinct. You already have people in the East by the 4th century that are harboring this instinct that they can sort of just, if the truth demanded it, according to their understanding, they could just set up their own little schism, a justified breakaway from not only Rome, but from even the ecumenical councils. So it doesn't shock me if that's already there in the 4th century for that to be there in the 8th century.
Definitely, yeah. I was about to say you've said more elegantly and more intelligently what I've been thinking for a while about how there seems to be this theological precedent that you've just elucidated, where if something is not in accord with Scripture or tradition, in the case of the iconoclasts, then they're not willing to submit to Rome out of principle, because they're not going to submit to Rome at the expense of the betrayal of revelation as they understand it. Now, one can make the argument that the iconoclasts, like other types of fundamentalists today, confuse interpretation with revelation. That charge or argument could be leveled against them. But at the same time, it is an interesting principle that does stand, that we see since the 3rd, 4th century, early on, and the subsequent centuries up till Nicaea II, as you say, because there is this priority of revelation in the Christian mind and Christian thought and theology, that is so heavily emphasized that primacy has to be understood and filtered through it, which is why, as we'll talk about later, when we see statements about the primacy of the Bishop of Rome being talked about as the source of authority and as coming from Christ himself, it is instantiated divine revelation that this is true, not just, at least in the Western understanding, that it's not just, because of synodal decisions or things like that. So yeah, those are just my thoughts. I wanted something you said too. I know that this episode is not about the 9th century, but I just wanted to ask about what was the process of Pope Hadrian II in the 9th century raising the status of Nicaea II to ecumenical council? Because I've recently read Dvornik's book on the Photian Schism, and at least to my knowledge, I forget him. I guess I was focused more on everything else about Photius and the debates that go on there and the jurisdictional stuff. But can you talk about the status of Nicaea II going from a local synod to an ecumenical council, and was it by papal ratification or by a sort of reception theory?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, this is something that comes up a lot. It just so happens that what's his name, Criag Truglia brings this up. This whole idea of papal ratification theory. Mm-hmm. I've never really spoken at length in a video format or anything like that on my understanding of the papal ratification theory, because it takes a lot of unpacking, but the Catholic Church recognizes that a council is not ecumenical just because the Pope ratifies a synod. That's not true. And so some people out there think that that's what we believe, but it's not what we believe. But Pope Hadrian I had some demands about the jurisdiction of Sicily, the churches in Calabria, and the churches in the prefecture of Illyricum, and the acts of Nicaea came back to Hadrian without any satisfactory letter explaining that those territories were justly returned to the Apostolic See. And so we get this from a famous letter that Hadrian wrote to Charlemagne, where he expresses that the council was correct and praiseworthy in its condemnation of iconoclasm. But he also mentions how this issue of those territories not being restored could potentially lead to an excommunication of the emperor. And the Pope seems to be well aware that it's really into that. It's really something that the emperor will have to undo. It doesn't seem like he expects the bishops at the council to really do that. So this is something that the emperor didn't say, okay, let's address this concern about the Pope. Let's just tell him that, look, jurisdiction changed. The emperor has the right to redraw the boundaries of the empire, and since the boundaries of the empire accord with state and church, Constantinople gets these lands. No, there's nothing in the council about the issue, which tells me that the emperor simply wanted to punt the issue. The emperor was hoping that by being silent, there might be some sort of a delay and maybe a forgetfulness on the side of Rome. Obviously, it was a test. How is Rome going to respond to this? Of course, Pope Hadrian didn't respond in a way that he speaks about it. He's far more diplomatic about the issue, but he does hesitate, and he doesn't even ratify. He never sent a letter back to the Empress saying that he ratifies the council. And so by the time you get to the situation with Pope Nicholas and Photius in the 860s, late 850s, early 860s, Pope Nicholas knows about this issue that Hadrian didn't get his demands met. And so Nicholas realizes that there's no confirmation in the papal archives that the emperor of Constantinople ever satisfied those demands. And so because of that, even Pope Nicholas I only counted 6 ecumenical councils. And so part of the issue with Photius versus Ignatius which is really the party of the Phocians versus the party of the Ignatians. And then there was another party who didn't like either of them. But the whole issue there was that Rome would bargain with Constantinople. If you fulfill the demands of Hadrian I back in 787, then we'll count Nicaea II ecumenical, because that was one of the goals of the Emperor Michael III, who wanted he wanted the Council of Nicaea II to be sort of announced as fully ecumenical, because it had been sort of running through the debate halls, of Constantinople for some time. And so, that didn't get fulfilled once again until the Council of 879, which was read by Pope Nicholas's successor, Pope Hadrian II. And the emperor finally said, okay, you get these lands back. But ultimately, in terms of the prefecture of Illyricum, you have the king of the Bulgars eventually used his royal and secular authority to kick out the Latins. So, due to military force, the Byzantine emperor did satisfy the demands of Hadrian I. He was late in doing so, but he did it. But it doesn't really matter, because the Bulgarian king, met with, sword, prevented any of the Latin missionaries from continuing. So, then he only welcomed the Byzantines after that. So, so at that point, Hadrian II had to accept Nicaea II. That was part of the bargain, as the Seventh Ecumenical Council.
Gotcha. Yeah, thank you for that detailed history synopsis and summary. I appreciate it. And so my next question for you, Erick, is, there's a lot of discussion about papal supremacy, papal primacy, papal infallibility, and in the secondary literature, Dvorak himself will talk about episodes in church history that are constitutive of papal supremacy. He'll say that. He gives the examples of, in passing, of Hormisdas and Agatho. Of course, his work on the Photian Schism is not on those subjects, but he still uses that in passing. And when I was reading that, I'm like, you can't just say that and not say anything else, dude. Like, what the heck? He's just like, oh yeah, by the way, papal supremacy, and then just like going on. But so my question for you is, what is papal supremacy? And more specifically, what is papal supremacy at this time in church history at Nicaea II, 787? So what would have been the understanding of papal supremacy, if there was such a thing, at this time in church history?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's no way to really capture all the data, into a small video like this, but this kind of runs parallel with pretty much every bit of critical scholarship in the 21st century, late 20th, early 21st century. For example, the switch from systematicians to biblicists. For example, in the Reformed world, the conservative world, even in the evangelical world, the fundamentalists, and here I'm talking historically about the classical fundamentalists. They were systematicians. They viewed the Bible, Genesis to Revelation, as like one book, one author, and so we can kind of make systematic theology from the text, because we just assume that every author and every book is saying one message, Well, then you had scholars come along and say, well, there's a problem with that, because specific authors mean different things with the same word. And there may not be one author, to Isaiah. There might be two. There might be several authors with different intentions. There might be several different authors in the Pentateuch.
Mm-hmm.
When we talk about it, you start getting the emergence of like Pauline theology or Johannine theology, or Matthean Christology, Lucan Christology, because these biblicists, these biblical theologians, started to notice that when you just try to be like a systematician, where you just assume the whole Genesis to Revelation is one book, you just assume that everybody's saying the same thing, you lose details that are specific and unique to the author of particular books. And so then you had the emergence of biblical theology. And then you started having, now if you were going for a dissertation in theology, you couldn't just say the Bible says.
Right.
You have to say, no, Paul, according to Paul, or for Paul, or for Peter, or for Mark, this is the situation.
Mm-hmm.
So you get more perspectival.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's the same thing when you come to the papacy with supremacy. It's perspectival. According to whom? Well, according to this Byzantine Greek theologian, this is the case. Well, according to Pope Hadrian, this is the case. Whereas before, it was assumed by both Greek and Latins, Catholics and Orthodox, that they could just refer back to the first millennium as the church. But you can't do that, because they're not going to want to accept what certain popes say. They're going to want to accept what certain Greeks say, and then Catholics are going to emphasize what certain popes have said, to the contrary of what other characters in the East have said. So the scholarship on this question necessarily parallels the transition from systematicians or systematic theology to biblical theology. So in the same way, you've got systematic ecclesiology or systematic ecclesial history, now to a more perspectival church history. Church history according to a specific person, So according to the persons of the Pope, of what papal supremacy means is that Christ, built a certain blueprint for the church. And part of that blueprint for the foundation includes this singular presidency of Peter. Presidency, primacy, supremacy. The etymology of these words really doesn't carry the meaning necessarily. Supremacy just means the highest. Well, that could refer to the primus, the first. And if you make a list of the apostles, Peter's at the top. So Peter's the supreme. But what does it mean by supreme? What does it mean by presidency? Whatever that means, these popes definitely believed that when Christ, when he developed the code of the DNA of the church, he definitely has the apostles fulfilling this place of government. You will be seated on the 12 tribes. You'll be seated on 12 thrones, ruling and judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Obviously, when he ascends into heaven, he sends them into Jerusalem, where they're going to receive power, to be able to, disciple, teach, preach, sanctify through the sacraments, all these things. But within that apostolic government, part of the DNA is that Peter has a specific position that is for the sake of unity. It's for the sake of preventing divisions. It's preventing cracks and fractures to the visible unity of the church. The popes eventually articulated this view that in order to have that function of preventing cracks and divisions, you can't just have an influence of unification. Like, hey, I'm here to really encourage you to be unified. There were some people who looked at it that way, but the popes they really came down on this view that in order for the in order for Peter's office to really sort of take action or have a purpose, it has to have the authority of unification. So in other words, a unification that comes by way of command. You know, and so the popes definitely believe that this is what was meant when Christ gave the keys to Peter. Among other things, you know, they viewed it as basically there's different levels to the keys. There's a priest who absolves you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. He's using the keys to absolve you of your sins, right? So that's the church functioning to, you know, authoritatively pardon. But there's also the role of the keys in the administrative discipline, and so they, you know, that would not be in the hands of the priests. You know, so where they might be able to bind and loose sins in the confessional, when it comes to administrative discipline, you'd have to go to the bishop's throne, right? Presbyters don't have jurisdiction in that case. So you can already see the keys have a multifaceted application in the church. And so they also believe that Rome, where Peter's succession took, had a peculiar place in embodying this authority of unification. And so that required Rome possessing unique privileges over the entire church, over every bishop, over every council, and over every territory where there was a Christian mission. And so that's the line the popes take. You know, what we get very clearly from Nicaea II from the East, it's not really direct. You know, they clearly accepted Hadrian as an Orthodox primate. And Hadrian was not silent about his claims. So, you know, the historian is kind of left to say, well, you know, here are some observations that can't be ignored. They clearly thought Hadrian was Orthodox.
Right, yeah, yep.
You know, whether you believe they, you know, got angry and ripped out his letters and changed it around or not, doesn't really matter. They still viewed him as Orthodox. And Hadrian was unmistakable about his claims to the divine origin of the papacy. So it becomes tricky with the Byzantines because they give certain evidences that show forth that that when push comes to shove, they'll go with tradition over the Pope. You see that, you know, not with every Greek bishop or every Eastern bishop,
right?
But you do see this inclination like that, and so you don't necessarily see that at the council. At the council, they refer to the Pope as the head of all, the head of all the churches of God.
Right.
So they clearly understand a universal primacy, a universal supremacy. The head is the top, right? The head is the highest. So they definitely believe in a papal supremacy. Notice I put the indefinite article. So they definitely believe in a papal supremacy, but that papal supremacy could be a weak one. So it's difficult to really point down. You know, it's like putting it's like trying to get a metal detector and putting it over a patch of grass that's got a bunch of metal bolts underneath. It's like the radar is going to pop off. Oh, well, here's an answer. Well, here's an answer, but here's an answer, and here's another one. So it's not really like one view of what papal supremacy is.
Right.
So it's very, very difficult to answer that question. But that's what I could say for the time being.
Yeah, thank you very much, Eric. I really appreciate that. That was a very good answer, and it's very detailed. I really liked how you made the parallel and juxtaposition between what happened in biblical studies and biblical theology and systematic theology to what happened in papal studies and study in the first millennium of primacy between East and West. I think that's a very creative way of articulating it. So I like that.
Yeah,
pretty cool.
yeah, I appreciate that. That was kind of you.
So, yeah, so. Eric, this is something that I've been thinking about. In my own reading and studies, I've kind of been convinced of this, basically going off of what you said, where while it's true that there are titans or giants in the East, that one can make the substantial argument held to a divine primacy of the Bishop of Rome in the West, such as St. Maximus the Confessor, St. Theodore the Studite, the monk of Studium, various, I'm forgetting the name, you would probably know, but various Syrian monks in the 9th century, I believe.
Yeah.
And then also, what's his name? Dora, Theodore of Dora?
Oh, yeah, that's Stephen of Dor.
Stephen of Dor.
That's Dor, Palestine, yeah.
Yeah, so while we have different Eastern figures that we can argue held to a divine primacy of the Bishop of Rome, and even, I mean, in his book, His Broken Body, Father Cleanwork says explicitly that St. Theodore the Studite held to basically a Roman Catholic view of divine primacy. And I'm just like, what? Like, you can say that? He can say that? Is he allowed to say that? And so I find it kind of, it's interesting. So while that is true, I found an overplay sometimes by older Catholic apologists, by the likes and ilks of Fortescue, for example, even though I don't have anything against Fortescue, but in this particular instance, well, maybe I do have something against him. There's a little bit of simplicity where it's almost as if one gets the impression from him in some of his articles and some of his books that every single Eastern patriarch held to the Western view of primacy. And if you say no to that, he'll say, well, what about, St. Theodore the Studite? What about, the figures I've just listed from the East? And while it's true, one can make that strong argument for that. And I don't really think that the Orthodox counterclaims to the view of primacy in those Eastern fathers are really sufficient. Just briefly, for example, how many will respond to Theodore the Studite's view as emphasizing that he held to a divine institution of the Pentarchy. But really, from my reading of St. Theodore the Studite, those two are not, it's a both and. It's not that it's divine primacy of the Bishop of Rome or divine Pentarchy. It's both for him. He believes that they're both divine, and it's part of his ecclesiology. That's an oversimplification, but that's basically my view. And then also, I know that some try to backpedal the claims of St. Maximus the Confessor by basically saying when he was under duress and torture from the Byzantines that he said, well, even if an angel from heaven came and preached another gospel, even if the Bishop of Rome was that, then I will go with tradition and revelation over against the Bishop of Rome. And it's true that he said that, but at the same time, I don't really think that's sufficient to mitigate what he said about the divine primacy. And for, as you've argued yourself in your articles on St. Maximus the Confessor, and I know there's Father Luth who tries to argue that Maximus didn't really mean what he said, or to basically backpedal to say, well, it doesn't necessarily mean Vatican I or high primacy. And to that, I would say, well, it's definitely at least in continuity with it, and it's definitely not a conciliaristic type of ecclesiology for sure. And I'm sorry for being long-winded about this, but all of this is to say, my growing understanding and reading is that I'm really seeing the wisdom and intelligence of the Chieti document. And I know maybe that'll get me in trouble, but the reason I say that is because in the Chieti document, it mentions about how there are different views in both the West and the East, that there are really different theologies. And I really, from my own reading of church history, I don't see how that's not the case. That's not to take away anything from Catholicism necessarily, or Orthodoxy necessarily. But I think if we're honest, I don't see how else to reconcile. Because, for example, in your article, you mention how you asked the question, did everyone in the East at this time accept papal supremacy or infallibility? And you say probably not. And like when I read that, I was like, yeah, that's a very fair assessment, because I think it would be unrealistic to think otherwise. But at the same time, the West is the West and the East is the East. And I'll end on this and then ask you for your thoughts on this ramble. Is that it seems unfair to me, to large extents and certain extents, to judge the theology of the West by Eastern standards, especially modern day Eastern standards, and vice versa, to judge Eastern theology by the standards of Western Latin theology. And it seems to me that the only possible way to go forward is basically what Ratzinger has talked about in his interviews when he was cardinal, is that both sides pretty much just need to accept as legitimate the doctrinal developments that have happened in the first and second millenniums with both respective traditions. So I know that's a little bit beyond the scope of Nicaea II, but it's definitely related, and it's been on my mind a lot. So I just wanted to voice that and ask you your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, it's excellent. And like I was saying before, it goes both ways, right? Because just like it might be potentially a problem if Maximus or Photius, and some other significant Eastern saints, just like it would be a problem for the Catholic Church or for Catholic apologists, for these guys to sort of reject the papacy. It would be equally problematic for the Orthodox if Pope Gelasius taught papal supremacy, right? And so that's why I try to emphasize that both Catholics and Orthodox have sort of had to clean out their eyes and to sort of clear their vision, because the historians are all not parroting the same old horn that Orthodox apologists were squeezing back in the 19th century, and same thing with the Catholics. The critical historians are finding out that what Catholics used to say in the 17th century, the 18th century about the Greek schismatics, and is not really the case when you look at the details of history. So it goes both ways, and what does somebody do? And this is kind of what I get into in my book that I've written on the papacy. The manuscript, the first edition was done a long time ago, so a lot of it is my views from a year plus ago. But what do you do in this kind of a situation? Because at the Council of Florence, it was the view of both the Catholics and the Orthodox that the church fathers cannot disagree with each other.
Yeah.
They believe that, no, these are venerated church fathers. The Holy Spirit made his home in these men and women. He was leading them, and they can't disagree, because that would mean to say that there's a division in the Holy Spirit. Of course, you had some clever voices that came out and said, well, what about St. Gregory of Nyssa's universalism? What about, I think, St. Epiphanius's anti-icono? He was against the idea of using images in church. Certain saints taught things that were later rejected by the wider church. Mark of Ephesus brought this point up. Photius did, preceding Mark of Ephesus, centuries prior. St. John of Damascus said, okay, maybe there might be one church father, maybe one or two isolated situations where they disagree with the church. But you certainly can't have a situation where significant fracture in belief between the fathers of the East and fathers of the West exists. And that belief really goes, it still continues to this day in strict Eastern Orthodox conservatives. The traditionalists, and the same thing with the strict traditionalists in the Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
But I think we need to be open to some new discoveries here. So I think that it has to be admitted that there was a difference between East and West, and there was a difference between West and West. There was a difference between East and East.
Yeah, exactly.
It's really difficult to come to these admissions, because basically what it does, and I'm going to speak here plainly, what it does is it basically it's like telling your captain, hey, your map has been flawed, your compass has been broken. You don't know how to tell the weather because your meteorologists have been confused. And so we need to go back to the drawing board to see, how to reconcile the problem. How can we find home base? And to tell that to the Catholics or to the Orthodox is insulting, because it would almost imply that the Holy Spirit has become broken. This is why I'm treading very lightly, because it does come as a little bit of a shocker, to both sides, that you have to, kind of like the systematicians were scandalized by the biblical theologians. You kind of have to take things in a perspectival way. So I think the Catholic side wins, not by much. When it comes to just the raw investigation of history, I don't think the Byzantine side wins. I don't, and there's more competitors. It's not just the Latin view or the Roman view versus the Greek view. You've got more competitors out there. You've got people who are just willing to defy everybody. I mean, people like to cite Maximus the Confessor and what he said at his trial. I think it was in Byznia, where he said that, I don't care what Rome says, I'm going to hold to the truth. Well, he didn't just say that. He said he doesn't care what anybody believes.
Good point. Yeah, that's actually a really good point.
So if you want to get strict with this Maximian confession, then you're treading towards some sort of Maximian isolationism, or a Maximian independency, where he was willing to break communion with all the patriarchs, all the bishops, for the sake of the truth. Right. And that kind of ecclesiology doesn't get much welcome in either Catholic or Orthodox circles. Right.
Yeah.
So at that point, he might even be more of a Lutheran foundation. I don't think he was supporting Lutheranism. Don't get me wrong.
I get your point. Yeah.
I think that at the end of the day, when you take the enormity of the citations from history, where the Greeks accepted papal command without refutation, and they maintained communion with the Pope, I think that is significant, because it shows that they were willing to be in communion with this belief system about papal supremacy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whereas Rome never tolerated the idea of episcopal equality.
Right.
So if we're looking at a competition from that angle, I think the fact that, like Father Klunework admits, like Father Schmemann admits, and like others, like Father Price admits, the Byzantine toleration, no matter how painful it was inside their hearts, of these papal claims sort of being outward, that moves the needle for me.
Yeah, I really agree with that, Eric. I really appreciate that. And it's, it's just like you were saying before with the Western church fathers, the Latin fathers, who accepted the filioque, which from my own reading of church history, I don't really see how that's a controversy. I understand that it is a controversy, and I don't want to be naive and be like, why doesn't everyone just agree with this? Like, I'm not saying that or trying to be stupid or anything like that. But at the same time, it's, Yaroslav Pelikan in his second volume of church history talks about how St. Augustine's De Trinitate, his work on the Trinity, where he talks about the filioque, is not translated in Byzantine Greek into Byzantine Greek until, I want to say, the 14th century, to where when giants such as Palamas and his followers come across the text, they're scandalized and shocked because, contrary to the modern pop Orthodox apologetics, St. Augustine was venerated as a saint in the East in the diptychia of the Orthodox churches and the Oriental Orthodox churches too, for centuries. And so when a venerable saint of the Orthodox West, in their perspective, holds to the filioque, which is tantamount to pneumatological heresy and damnation, that's scandalous. And so
it would be like a saint holding Arianism.
Yeah. I mean, so I kind of can sympathize with that in terms of the scandal, but like for me, in my own thinking, it's not really that big of a deal. And I try to want to be fair, but I honestly don't understand some of these perspectives. They seem to, while I want to be empathetic, I still it's hard for me to fully understand, because for me, it just seems like bordering on either an irrational rigidity. But I understand there's a paradigmatic shift, of course, that has happened. I mean, I'm a 21st century person, so I have to take that into account too. So Charles Taylor and Brad S. Gregory have talked about the shift in culture. Right. So I want to recognize that and be respectful, but at the same time, insofar as arguments are arguments, I find them insufficient. And also, the fact that not only St. Augustine, but St. Ambrose and Hilary of Portois and other Latin figures, this to me also kind of undermines the whole project in the East in the 20th century, which I think is a noble endeavor, of the neo-patristic synthesis that wants to incorporate the Latin theological tradition into Orthodox theological thought. And while I am all for that, I'm saying go Orthodox, go. Like, that is great. Do that. Fundamentally, for me, it's going to fail because the Latin West fundamentally and essentially doesn't have the same theology on the issue. And I think that's why, for me, I don't think it can really work, even though I have nothing but respect and honor and veneration for Lasky and Florowski.
Meyendorff.
And Meyendorff. Well, maybe less so for Meyendorff, if I'm honest. But yeah, for a lot of these writers, I have a lot of respect for the Orthodox theological tradition. And so, do you have any thoughts on that before I move on to the next question?
Yeah, those were very good thoughts. The only thing I would add is this, that you are correct to say that the Latin patristic tradition does not agree with the neo-patristic position. But there's a further consequence, because the Orthodox admit that Rome was at least the head of the churches in the first millennium. They may have a weak understanding of that, but they still believe that Rome was at the top of the hierarchy, even if that hierarchy was purely symbolic. They still view it as real. It's not like fiction, right? They still have they still believe that Rome was the head of the church. And, Saint Theodore the Studite even compares Rome to I think it was Saint Theodore, could have been another author, who compares Rome to the five senses, the site of the five senses. If it's true that the Latin patristic tradition, and obviously that's going to be the Roman position, if the Roman position is antithetical and heretical according to modern Eastern Orthodox standards, then that would mean that the primate of the Eastern Orthodox in the West for the first millennium was a heretic for 1,000 years.
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm.
Because the bishops of Rome in the first millennium, according to the Orthodox today, they're supposed to be the primates of the Western Orthodox Church, the Orthodox Church in the West.
Right.
But since scholarship, reason, logic, and all the available data supports that the Latin patristic tradition doesn't accord with the neo-patristic synthesis that is promoted by the Orthodox dogmaticians and the Orthodox traditionalists, I think it poses a very bad backfiring to the reliability and the credibility of the Orthodox position today.
I agree. Yeah, and I have nothing but respect for the likes of Schmemann and.
Oh yes, I love them.
And I love these Orthodox intellectuals, and I was a little bit hard on Meindorf. He is a good writer. There's just some disagreements I have with him where I can get past it. But also, Papadakis and other just if you allow a quick tangent, because I want to do my best to be honorable, and I care about part of the reason why I hold the views that I hold to, and where if I'm coming off too strong and sort of being apathetic, I'm not trying to, or if that impression has been made, I'm not trying to. But the reason for that appearance is because I fundamentally care about what's true and what's real. I don't really care about arbitrary dogma. Now, dogma in principle and theological and philosophical distinctions for dogma, I'm okay with. I don't have an argument against dogma in principle, but when you tell me believe this because I said so, just because I said so, then we have a problem. And so I have I'm a very skeptical and curious person, but I'm also want to be patient and have been patient because I've read Sachensky's books on the papacy and the filioque. I've read Papadakis' book on the Christian East and the Rise of the Papacy. I've read The Invention of Peter by Demopoulos, despite all the interesting machinations of his prolegomena. And I've read, I'm going to butcher the name, but Goethe, is that how you say it?
Yeah, that's Father Vladimir Gaute is how I've always pronounced it.
Yeah, his book on the papacy, its historic origin and primitive relations with the Eastern churches. And actually, if you'll again just allow me, but
go ahead.
So this book, Sachensky's The Papacy. I also have his filioque, but it's over there, and I don't feel like getting up. As I said, Papadakis, Demopoulos, Meindorf, Constantinople, Rome, and Moscow. Was a good book. Had some disagreements, but yeah, Meindorf. Cringe moment. Michael Welton. Terrible book. I gave it a 1 star on Goodreads. Meindorf again with Schmemann and others. I love the icon, by the way. Beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Oliver Clement, as I mentioned earlier. You are Peter. Michael Welton again 1 star for 2 paths. Vigenopoulos, his book, where he basically exposits on Zazoulis and being as communion and the one and the many type of theology.
Yep.
And then, last but not least, Father Laurent Kleinworth with Broken Body. And now, currently, John Ramsey or Father Monk Patrick, the church. And I show that not to like, show off or anything like that. Cause I mean, first of all, you've read like 50 billion of books on the subject. But also just because I really do care about Eastern theology and I respect it. And it has a very important place in my heart. And to be honest, there's been times where I've wanted to become Orthodox, and I'm still tempted to become Orthodox too some days, just for its practical type of life and asceticism. But when I look back about, more theological issues on the West, I can't really compromise in good conscience right now. And so, I just want to be honest and open about my convictions and feelings on the subject. So
yeah, I get the same feeling about Anglicanism sometimes. Because when I was an Anglican, I didn't, you don't really have to reconcile so much. Anglicans can sort of forbear with the historical inconsistencies in some sense. But when you settle in to Anglicanism, then you start to, you can't avoid the intellectual problem, and then it becomes an issue of honesty over time, and then your conscience starts to eat at you. So I just couldn't be an Anglican for that reason. Although, if you catch me at the first moment I wake up in the morning, and you throw a BCP, Book of Common Prayer, in front of me, and you throw me into an Anglican chapel, my instincts will feel like, yes, this is where I want to be. But I get it in the Anglican ordinariate, but there's something about the APA Anglican continuum that I was in that just sort of was separated from Canterbury, separated from Rome, separated from, all the liberal enemies of God. But then you have to, defend the position of this schism, and that becomes enormously more difficult to bear.
Yeah, I was going to say, hashtag that Edward Denny life. Joking. But so I apologize if it's too redundant, but I do want to ask you this question. You did talk about it, but just bear with me. No
worries.
Yeah, so in your article, Erick, you give several citations about the Bishop of Rome being the head of the church. You mention different patristic citations and give instances, particularly from the first millennium, but also at the Second Council of Nicaea II, 787. So how would you respond to someone who would say, in response to your citation of the Bishop of Rome being the head of the church, someone who would say that this doesn't prove the Catholic view of primacy, for at the most, or the very least, it only refutes Orthodox arguments that say there is no visible universal head of the church in any sense, and that the Bishop of Rome can be understood and conceived of as the head of the church in certain ways, as protos, as first, as chief, a primacy of honor, but not of honor alone, a primacy of honor with real power, with appellate jurisdiction, but not Vatican I level. Arguments made by Father Laurent Kleinwerk amount to this thesis in certain ways. So how would you respond to that?
Yeah, it's a good response. It's kind of like, that's kind of the position that, Father Laurent Kleinwerk puts forward. It's kind of the same position that Ubi Petrus puts forward.
Right.
Some of these people online. And so the first thing I would say is this: let's just say that the historical data proves, and when we say prove, this is something I want to pause on, because some people who may not be well versed in what constitutes evidence, they may see the word prove and they think, oh, he's about to show us what necessarily must only mean papal supremacy like Vatican I.
Right. Yeah.
And that's not necessarily what the word the word means. At a court, there's different kinds of evidence that are acceptable. It's not just video or DNA evidence that is admitted. If it was only DNA and video evidence that was admitted, my goodness, I mean, the world would, the United States jurisprudential organization would be a machine for injustice.
Yep.
So you got to allow other kinds of evidence. So when I say prove, I mean there might be a variety of ways to construe the evidence, but it might be highly suggestive towards Vatican I. Mm-hmm. It may not be, a visible arrow right on target, Vatican I. But let's just say that the data of Nicaea II or other councils proves a really high authoritative primacy that was created by Jesus in Peter and continued by the bishops of Rome.
Yeah.
But just a hair less than Vatican I. Mm-hmm. Or an elephant tail less than Vatican I, that would still refute both Catholicism and Orthodoxy. Hmm. Because the Orthodox Church has not reproduced that since the schism, even in Constantinople.
Right. Yeah.
They believe the imperial system is what created the stance of Constantinople. So that would be my first reaction. I would say, if you really want to go with this whole thing of just, showing that the patristic data gets you an elephant's tail just under Vatican I, but not Vatican I.
Right. Yeah.
What I would say is that pretty much takes the foundation away from Catholicism, and it takes the foundation away from the Eastern Orthodox Church. And the proof of that is not simply that the fact that the Orthodox churches have not reproduced that view of primacy since the schism, but it's also proven by the majority view of ecclesiology in the Orthodox Church today, which is symbolized in the Russian Orthodox Church. It's the largest body of Orthodox Christians in the world.
Right. Yeah.
And the Russian Orthodox Church does not believe in any kind of authoritative primacy.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
So unless the Orthodox want to walk on the thin limb of trying to say that the patristic data is an elephant's tail less than Vatican I, while he understands that the Eastern Orthodox churches never reproduced that view of primacy for 1,000 years, and while he admits that the majority of Orthodox believers today reject that entirely anyway, at that point, I would just say, where are you going? Where are you going with this? You might refute Catholicism, but Catholicism only gets hit with the bullet after the Orthodox get shot through in the heart. Mm-hmm. It's a double kill.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, that's why, just for population numbers alone, Russian Orthodox theology is increasingly more important in the global perspective of theologies, for the very reason that you just listed, that it is the leader in world orthodoxy in terms of population. And so it's really no skin off their back that Constantinople or Alexandria go into schism, to be perfectly honest. I still, and again, I don't take any delight in that at all. I hate that there's a schism there, because I love, because I mean, it's something beautiful that Pope Francis has said when he had his meeting with Patriarch Kirill. He said to him, and he looked in the eye, he said, "We are brothers. We both have the same baptism." And I don't think that's fully realized, because this is really like many Eastern Catholics have said that they feel like they are the children of divorced parents. But that's what it really is analogously, in an analogical way, is like a divorce, a separation with wounds on both sides by different bad things that have happened by both sides in church history and all that. But yeah, I think it's important to emphasize, and for Catholic theologians too, to kind of concentrate a lot of their efforts too on Russian theology. That's something that I actually really liked about Father Adrian Nichols, who's written on the subject. I need to read more of his book on the subject too, but he talks about Orthodox theology in the Russian diaspora, and especially after the Iron Curtain fell, it allowed him more research access to go into Russia and other Catholics as well, because after the Soviet Union collapsed, there was no longer the communist, atheistic, anti-Christian persecution that had been happening since the Bolsheviks, basically. But yeah, sorry, that was kind of a rant, but yeah.
No, I appreciate it. Yeah, so that would be the first thing. The second thing I would say, and I'll just put this in a nice, simple, and short and sweet way, is that when something is divinely instituted, and it's so specific to Peter and his successors, divine institution must mean divine irreversibility. Because as soon as you start to say that something is divinely instituted and then temporal, transitory, open to corruption, now you have to, when you open the door to that, in comes questions about the episcopate, apostolic succession, the divinity of the office of presbyter. I mean, not even the Baptists are going to go to this point where they would say that, this is reversible. They all admit that bishops and deacons is a divine institution, that even though they believe they can reproduce it with just a bunch of cool pastors, it doesn't mean that they believe that that the office themselves, the conceptual office and the ontological office, was somehow withered away in corruption. So in the same way, if you're willing to say, well, yeah, these popes talk about Christ's design for the church and Peter, and this power of unification and Peter's successors, and that it's divinely instituted, and that that it's divinely guided, and that it's the way to make peace and unity in the church, but it slowly corrupted in the 9th, 10th, 11th century. You're basically committing the same sort of mistake by admitting that it's divinely instituted and and subsequently humanly reversible.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't fit. If something's divinely instituted, like the papal office, then it should be divinely irreversible. So, we might be open to questions like the papal West was, where we need to be open to the situation of a papal failure and what that entails, but not open to the dissolution of the papal office itself, where the Greeks went farther and just simply said the office is dissolved itself. And Constantinople, as the imperial city, took its place, which is a non-divinity. So.
Yeah, thank you for that, Eric. I really appreciate that. Those are very insightful, and I figured you would anticipate that type of objection. But as I was reading that article of yours, I wanted to sort of steelman the Orthodox perspective. Yeah. Because I do think that view of primacy in the Orthodox Church, maybe it's just my Catholic bias and background, but it strikes me as more substantially better and sophisticated. That's why in terms of Orthodox theologians, I really like Zazoulis and John Ramsey's book. I'm enjoying, because it's more it's more beefy, and the same thing with Clean Work as well. It's more defensible, in my opinion. Yeah. So let me ask you this. In your article, your second article, when you go through objections, you talk about one objection that you've heard from readers online, that the Second Council of Nicaea's use of the famous Matthean "Tu es Petrus, thou art Peter," Matthew 16:18 through 19, that citation applies to the whole church and not only Rome, showing that in reality they had no belief in a Petrine supremacy individuated uniquely to the Bishop of Rome. I like how eloquently you put that, because I was just going to ask it in sort of a dumb way, like, do you think they thought the Bishop of Rome was all that? So how would you respond to that? Because I know you go into that in your article, but like, if you don't mind reproducing that.
Yeah. So, I mean, when Christ speaks to Peter, he's talking about the universal church. He's saying, he basically says, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will never prevail against it." That's not a reference to some sort of Church of Rome that was envisioned there in Caesarea Philippi. That was in reference to the Messianic society of the people of the New Covenant. So but the simple fact of the matter is the role that Peter plays is a foundational one. So when you have a foundation, the building stands on top of it. So in some sense, Peter has an office that reaches to the whole universal church. So, that's, and what is the nature of that reach? Well, Peter says it right afterwards. "I'll give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven." So it's definitely the foundational function that Peter is given is one of this, sacramento cultic administrative authority.
Yeah, definitely. And maybe it's just me, but for the life of me, and again, I really do try to be fair, but like, it's kind of a non sequitur to me, or a false dichotomy, because I don't see why it's not a both and. Like, I don't see why it's either this applies to the church universally, or it applies to the Bishop of Rome, because it's clear to me that the Latin theological tradition in the patristic era and in the first millennium, pre-schism even, if we want to limit ourselves to that era, that numerous bishops of Rome held that the text of Matthew's Gospel, St. Matthew's Gospel, they gave it a reading that many scholars call the ecclesiastical hermeneutic. In addition to a polyvalent hermeneutic of other views that Sachenski goes through as well, and I think rather balanced assessment as well, even though he disagrees with the Catholic position. Because for me, it seems odd, because it's very clear that popes like Victor, Stephen, Damasus, Gelasius, Leo, Gregory I, both the Pelagiuses, the Pope Pelagiuses, for everyone who's listening, yes, there's the Pope Pelagius, not the heretic against St. Augustine. That's a different bedtime story. But Hermistus, Agatho, Nicholas I, Hadrian II, Hadrian I, John VIII, etc., etc. Like, so in their writings, and when they comment upon the Matthean passage, they talk about this divinity of their office, that it was established by Jesus, that they have the authority to bind and loose, that they have this sacrosanct, sacerdotal, priestly power, and that they are the head of the church, the caput, as it's said in Latin, I believe, and they that they are the chief, and they have primus or protus in Greek, primus in Latin, and so it just seems to me that while everything you said is true, and I agree with it, I don't understand the objection in principle because it seems to me misguided. And what are your thoughts of that? If you want to push back against that or say, James, you're a dumpster fire.
No, so the objection that the papal interpretation is with respect to the ecclesiastical hermeneutic, meaning, can you just unpack that for a second there?
Yeah. What I'm saying is I don't understand why Orthodox make this dichotomy where it's either the text of St. Matthew either applies to the whole church at large and not only to the Bishop of Rome, and therefore it doesn't apply to the Bishop of Rome as the bishops of Rome understood it. And I understand that they're coming from a Greek theological or an Orthodox theological, Eastern theological perspective on this, and so they have to be committed to their theology. I understand that, but at the level of, I guess, as the texts present themselves to us, I find it really hard to reconcile such a claim. Reading the bishops of Rome, who again, the first millennium bishops of Rome are saints, with the exception that probably they wouldn't venerate Nicholas I, I don't believe. But prior, going further back than Nicholas, since he would probably be viewed as suspect, it seems to me kind of difficult to reconcile that. So does that make any sense?
That makes sense. Yeah. I when you read Matthew 16, you see ecclesiology, you see patronology, meaning study of Peter, but you don't see Romanology, something about the city of Rome. And so, naturally the Orthodox are going to want to call eisegesis on that. And it's understandable, but the issue is the patronology has within it the Romanology, because Peter stationed his bishopric in Rome permanently,
right?
And that's where his successorship took root. So the patronology is sort of like a tree under which a branch comes out of the Romanological interpretation of Matthew 16, and that's supported by their own saints, so.
Yeah, because and just to be clear for everyone listening, because I don't object or deny that the text of St. Matthew's Gospel applies to the Church Universal. I do believe that. I believe that there are multiple senses, a polyvalent exegesis of which Matthew 16 can be interpreted, and I think the historical record bears that out. So my objection and pushback on this Orthodox objection is mainly based upon first millennium post-New Testament historical interpretation of the biblical text, not in the biblical text itself necessarily, even though I think folks like Swansona have made really great arguments in exegesis for the internal coherence of papal theology within the biblical text. But my approach is more historical, post-New Testament, post-first century, where the bishops of Rome, who are the successors of St. Peter, interpret Matthew's gospel, and then also, John's gospel as well. Simon Peter, do you love me? Then feed my sheep, et cetera, et cetera. So I hope that just makes sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Yes.
Yeah. So, well, Erick, I think this will be the last question. I still, I feel kind of bad rambling on because I still have a lot of questions. Maybe if you're willing, I'd love to do a part 2 with you in the future.
Yeah, no problem at all.
Yeah. So this will probably be the last question then. And let me pull it up here. So in your article, you give this citation from the Greek text of the Council of Nicaea II, and it reads as follows: "For the holy and chief apostles themselves, who set up the Catholic and Orthodox faith, have laid it down as a written law that all who after them are to be successors of their seats should hold their faith and remain in it to the end." So my question is this, and it's going to be kind of a little bit long, but I'll try to be quick. Is I want to focus in on the phrase "remain in it to the end." This line speaks to perseverance. Remain in what? The answer to that is the faith of Peter and Paul. Until when? For how long? The answer to that is to the end. That is to say, for the entirety of the successors of Peter and Paul's pontificate, for the remainder of their earthly lives, basically. And so from this quotation, I want to focus in on the wording "should" here. It seems to me that this passage could perhaps be read like a moral obligation. It is an imperative, an ought, kind of makes me think of the Kantian distinction, ought implies can. But couldn't one argue, or beyond the sheer audacity in terms of argument or rhetoric, just in terms of strict logic, it doesn't seem to follow that just because the successors of Peter and Paul should hold to the faith of Peter and Paul, that therefore, that they ought to hold to the faith of Peter and Paul, that it is a moral obligation to do so, etc., that it is, therefore, it does not necessarily or inherently follow that the successors of Peter and Paul will hold to their faith or remain in it to the end, especially in a guaranteed Vatican I perpetuity sense. That seems like a non sequitur. How would you answer that type of argument? I know that's a lot, but
No, that's okay. Yeah. So, what I'll do is I'll just share my screen so I can show the Greek text. Is that possible for me to do now? Okay. So, I have been disabled from screen sharing, but that's okay. That's okay. What I'll do is I'll just read the Greek, and then if the readers want to go to my article, they can go to it when you link it at the bottom. Okay. So what the first point I want to say is that if we were to take the Greek, the Greek rendering, again, me personally, I don't think that that's what was stated at the council, but it is what's in the Greek codices of Nicaea II, as they came to survive in the East. If you want to read that text where it basically says that they should keep the faith or should remain in it, then yeah, it's a moral obligation, and a moral obligation by definition has to have the potency of failure. And so it would necessarily mean that not necessarily. It would most probably mean that the text is teaching a Petrine and Pauline successorship that's fallible. The Bishop of Rome is fallible. But the thing is, in the Greek text, the word "should" doesn't even show up. There is no word for "should," so that's an English input there. The Greek text literally, starting from their thrones, ton thronon, their thrones. Following that, it says ton thronon, auton, there, kai and aute, and diamanein, remain, eos, tes, sunteleis, which means remain in it to the consummation of all things. And I take that word sunteleis as when you look at the etymology of that word, the usage of that word, it's the same word, for example, that St. Matthew uses to translate Matthew 28, where Christ says, "I will be with you even to the sunteleos, even unto the end of the age."
Oh, interesting.
So it doesn't mean like you should remain in it. You should remain in it to the end of your personal life or something like that. It's to the consummation of the world, and the word "should's" not there. So it literally means that those who occupy their thrones remain in it to the end. So it doesn't say "should." The English translator of the Shaft series of the Fathers. I don't know the name off the top of my head, but obviously Shaft and I think Robertson and Henry Wace were editors of the book on the 7 ecumenical councils. They decided to put the word "should" there, but and it's a reasonable input, but it's not what the Greek says, and it doesn't make any sense if you think about it, because what is Hadrian saying there? What he's saying is that, look, you emperors, if you follow the tradition of the throne of Paul and Peter in Rome, your empire will prosper always. Well, why is that? Because Peter and Paul put it into writing that all of their successors will remain in their faith all the way to the end of time. So it would be foolish to say, hey, here's this possibly fallacious church in Rome, follow it and your empire will prosper.
Yeah.
What Hadrian is trying to say, or what the Greek revision is trying to say, is that the Pauline and the Petrine chairs in Rome, because that's what it means. The thrones there in the context is not referring to like the bishop of Antioch, the bishop of Corinth, the bishop of Ephesus. It's talking about the bishop of Rome, the chairs of Peter and Paul in Rome. What he's saying is that the successorship of those thrones in Rome have a written law which predicts that they will all remain in the faith until the consummation of all things. So the context is certainly talking about an enduring orthodoxy of Rome, and that's why the empire needs to just trust it and follow it. So yeah, so those 2 points is what I would say to respond to that. The word "should" is not there, so a moral obligation interpretation is not necessary. It's only possible. But I would say it's improbable in light of the argument and the context, and in light of that last word "sunt leis." Anytime the biblical authors use that Greek word for "until the end," "sunt leis," it's talking about the wrap up of human history. And I will be with you always, even to the end of the age. It's talking about something that will be perpetual till the end. Whereas a moral obligation interpretation would simply be on each individual to the end of their life. Like, this successor should remain in the faith, and the next successor should remain in the faith until he dies, and the next successor should remain in the faith until he dies. Whereas the Greek text is not saying that. He's saying that Peter and Paul's successors in Rome will remain in the faith until the consummation. So it's trying to talk about an everlasting Rome, an Orthodox Rome. So that's what I would say to that. So in other words, those who try to say that the Greek text of Hadrian is the one that was read at the council, in my opinion, that doesn't somehow undo the papal claims. It only solidifies it, really.
Yeah, definitely. And if you come on again, I'd definitely love to ask you in more detail about that, because I actually had several questions on Hadrian, and then also arguments from Criag Truglia that he made in his debate and his opening statement that we weren't able to get to. But I really appreciate your time, Erick. I really appreciate those distinctions and nuances that you've made, to use a favored Michael Lofton word. But if you don't mind, real quickly, I just want to try to sneak last one in.
Go ahead.
That, because I wasn't aware, I remember in reading your article, you talked about how "should" isn't in there in the translation. But I guess either I forgot or whatever, that Philip Schaff, in his translation, that it was a Protestant choice. Do you think that choice, or that translation choice, reflects Protestant bias, or do you think that it is lexically and like in terms like of being a good philologist that one could actually make that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I I'm not an expert in Greek. I did consult experts in Greek about this, so that I wouldn't just be competing with Schaff's translator. I don't know who he used, but one of the scholars in his board is the one who translated Nicaea II. I don't want to compete with him not being a Greek expert, right? So I consulted Greek experts on this issue. And they all confirmed that this word should's not there, and that it is an interpretive input. It might be a good one. It might be a good interpretive input. But it could be argued just as forcefully that it's just saying will remain until the end. And that seems to fit the context better, because if all that Hadrian is trying to say is that, hey, we have a moral obligation to keep the faith, so you should trust Rome. Well, everybody's got a moral obligation to keep the faith. So it doesn't it doesn't individuate Rome's enough in the way that Hadrian is trying to do. Do you see?
Gotcha. Yeah, definitely. And the reason why I thought of this question, because in my mind I had in the background of the Orthodox view of there's several Orthodox views, but a particular Orthodox view, namely found in Saint Mark of Ephesus. And yes, I did say Saint Mark of Ephesus. Hashtag Eastern Catholic life. But anyway, St. Mark of Ephesus, he talks about how, in his opinions on primacy, which the Catholic Church, rejects clearly, because he was the minority party at Florence, but he talks about how, well, there is a certain sense of perpetuity in the Bishop of Rome, in the successors of St. Peter, as long as and under the condition that the bishops of Rome follow the faith of St. Peter. And of course, he was referring to the Filioque controversy and also to the issue of papal authority at the Council of Florence there. So that was in my background, in my mind, thinking of this, because most Orthodox who are of this high papalist type of ecclesiology that we were talking about before, they will usually make these sort of distinctions where there is this sort of semi or conditional perpetuity, but it doesn't amount to Vatican I, and it's conditioned upon canonical procedure and holding to the faith of Peter, Orthodox understanding. So yeah, it's a good one. Mark of Ephesus obviously was a high papalist, right? Because he held to the Hadrianic corpus, he held to the Galatian corpus, he held to, certain, the Samakian corpus, and even some of the Acts of Blessed Sylvester. I think they were the pseudo writings, and he thought they were authentic. In any case, again, I go back to this critically. What Hadrian is saying here in the text seems to be a consumatory perpetuity. It's supposed to be there until the end of time, just like Christ says, "I'll be with you always, even into the end of the age." So when you have that kind of consumatory, perpetuity, believing that it could drop off from, it could be just sort of dissolved and put out of function for 1,000 years. And the Orthodox today don't even believe it needs to be resurrected. They believe the next 1,000 years can go without it, and that Christ can come back, and that it would just be something that existed for a blip in church history. Right.
So it comes roughly to the Orthodox ecclesiology today really can't stand on two legs if it wants to say that there is a divinely perpetual Petrine office in Rome. because as soon as you say that, but then also say, yeah, but it's sort of out of function and it may not even be there for the majority of church history, and we're better off now without it. That's like saying that, Toyota Corolla was created with 4 tires and an engine, but, somehow we're able to take the chassis and float it around and for the next, 50 years. I don't need tires and an engine anymore. That just doesn't make sense, because for you to get into it and say, I believe in a Petrine perpetuity in the Roman bishops by divine institution, but if he crosses the Orthodox line and becomes heterodox, then he's just as foul. He can go just as foul as anybody else.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Which means that the privilege that you attribute to him really isn't a privilege in any way, right? Because all it takes is for you to. What does it take for a priest in Thessalonica to lose his place in the church? Oh, he comes out as a heretic. Well, what does it take for the Bishop of Rome? Well, the same thing. It's a heretic. So now, what privileges does Rome have in this field? There is no privilege in this department anymore because they're reduced down to the same thing as everybody else. So the privilege of Rome then would be something else, like, well, it was the imperial city, or Peter's relics were there, Paul's relics were there, and so there was this mystical, miraculous intercession for a time, but not forever,
right?
So I would say that the Orthodox, it doesn't make sense. It's not coherent. I would say they should probably tone it down and say, no, we don't believe in a divinely instituted Petrine perpetuity. No. What we believe is that Rome started off as like the Mike Tyson of Orthodoxy. It was highly influential, very wealthy, very intelligent influencers were there. People traveled to Rome from all over. Peter and Paul were preached there, died there. You know what I'm saying? Some of these unsubstantial adornments. These are features that don't get into the blueprints of the church's design. Gotcha.
Yeah, I was about to say. Yeah, I was going to say this is a whole can of worms, and I'll just kind of like end with this: is that it goes into the question of then Cardinal Ratzinger's thesis of whether or not the papacy is in fact intrinsic to the episcopate rather than accidental and a human jurisdictionary thing that's optional, as other Orthodox argue for. So so Erick, thank you so much. That was incredible. That was great.
Thank you so much for having me on. It was great. I love talking about this.
Yeah, definitely. And for everyone out there, get Erick's book. Erick, when's your book on the papacy and filioque coming out?
That's a good question. So I'm hoping January.
Okay.
That it will be out. But we're kind of like in the design phase of things, and I didn't really, we have a tentative schedule for when these things are going to happen. But due to sicknesses, COVID, I was out for, like 2 weeks. I couldn't answer any emails. It may be delayed. So I don't know. We'll see. But I'm hoping January.
Gotcha. Yeah. I was about to say I had COVID back in April, so I know that sucks. Sorry to hear that. Glad you're better now though. So that's good.
Yeah.
Alrighty. Well, everyone look forward to that. And, I'd love to, when those come out, I definitely want to get my hands on them and read them and underline the crap out of them and then have you on again. So.
Yeah. We'll plan for this again. All right, James. Well, you take it easy and we'll talk soon.
All right. You have a good night, Erick.